I almost choked on my own drink when my sister pointed to the master suite and told my 6-year-old niece that soon this house will be yours. I turned to look at my mother, expecting her to correct this insane delusion, but instead she was smiling like it was a settled deal. She slid a stack of legal papers across my kitchen island and told me to sign over my property. So I looked her dead in the eye and asked, "Since when do you have a say about my house?" "My name is Morgan and I am 32. If you have ever been the scapegoat in a family that cares more about a fake image than their flesh and blood, stay right here. You will want to hear how I dismantled their entire lives." Growing up a black woman in affluent Atlanta, I learned quickly that perception is everything. My mother, Beatrice, was the undisputed queen of our church congregation. Her existence revolved around respectability politics, wearing the perfect hats, hosting charity drives, and projecting the image of a flawless, upwardly mobile family. I never fit into her pristine boxes. I was independent and stubbornly self-reliant. I paid my way through Howard by working double shifts, eventually building my career as a luxury real estate broker from the ground up. I never asked my parents for a dime. Meanwhile, my younger sister Sierra was everything my mother wanted. Sierra was 28, loud, flashy, and completely dependent on my parents. She loved posting a luxurious lifestyle on social media despite never holding a real job. But Sierra achieved the one thing my mother valued above all else. She married Connor. Connor was a 32-year-old white man, playing the part of old money perfection. He wore boat shoes, talked about his family trust fund, and gave my mother the social elevation she craved to show off to church friends. That afternoon was supposed to be a simple family barbecue to celebrate my biggest personal milestone. After years of grinding in real estate, I had finally purchased my dream home. It was a $1.2 million lake house outside the city limits. The property featured wraparound glass windows, a private dock, and a massive backyard. I invited my family because a small, naive part of me hoped my mother would be proud of me. Instead, she spent the first 2 hours ignoring me to dote on Connor and Sierra. I was standing in the kitchen wiping down the marble island when I heard Sierra walk into the living room with her daughter Lily. Sierra was pointing at the vaulted ceiling and the bay windows overlooking the water. "Look at this," Lily Sierra cooed, her voice carrying easily into the kitchen. "This is going to be your new playroom, and that big room upstairs with the balcony that will be Mommy and Daddy's room." I froze, the cloth slipping from my hand. I walked toward the archway just in time to see my mother approach the kitchen island from the patio. Beatrice carried her signature passive-aggressive smile, the one she used right before she did something manipulative. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and slid it across the marble countertop toward me. I looked down at the documents. The bold letters at the top made my blood run cold. It was a property deed transfer form, fully drafted, and already filled out with my name as the grantor, and Sierra and Connor listed as the grantees. All it needed was my signature and a notary stamp. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low so the guests outside on the patio would not hear. "It is the logical next step," Morgan, my mother, said smoothly, picking up a stray grape from the fruit platter. "You are a single woman. You have no husband and no children. What on earth do you need a 5-bedroom lake house for? It is completely excessive." I stared at her, genuinely struggling to comprehend her audacity. "I need it because I bought it," I replied. "I worked 80-hour weeks for 6 years to afford this down payment. This is my home, Mom. Do not be selfish." Beatrice snapped, her pleasant facade cracking instantly. "Your sister needs this space. Connor comes from a prestigious family and they need a home that reflects his status. They cannot raise Lily in that cramped apartment downtown. It is embarrassing for the family image. People at church are starting to ask questions about why my son-in-law is living in a rental. So your solution to church gossip is to steal my house and hand it over to your favorite daughter and her husband?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "You think because he is a white man who plays golf, he automatically deserves the fruits of my labor? I busted my back at an HBCU while you paid for Sierra to go on shopping sprees. I built my wealth. Connor just talks about his. If he is so rich, why can he not buy his own lake house?" "How dare you speak about Connor that way?" my mother hissed, slamming her hand on the counter. He brings class to this family. He elevates us. You have always been jealous of Sierra because she secured a good man while you are too focused on making money. You are going to sign this document today, Morgan. You owe this to your sister. I looked at the deed transfer resting on my new kitchen island. Then I looked at my mother, seeing the absolute conviction in her eyes that she could simply command me to give up my life savings for her golden child. The small, naive part of me that wanted her approval died right then and there. I picked up the thick stack of legal papers. My mother held out a pen, expecting me to submit just like my father always did. Instead, I grabbed the papers with both hands and ripped them straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the kitchen. I tossed the shredded pieces into the trash can. My mother stood frozen. Her confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure venom. I smiled. I ended the call immediately, severing the connection. I stood still in my foyer while her threat echoed loudly in my mind. Beatrice claimed she found a legal way to take my property. A normal person might have dismissed the ranting of an angry mother, but I knew Beatrice better than anyone else. She was resourceful and would go to absolute extremes to protect Connor and his image. I locked my front doors and activated the interior motion sensors. My adrenaline was pumping, but my professional instincts kicked into high gear. I was a high-level real estate broker, and I understood property law better than any amateur scheme she could possibly invent. No one could legally take a house from the sole deed holder without massive financial leverage or a catastrophic legal lien. I bypassed my kitchen entirely and walked straight down the hallway into my home office. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and booted up my computer monitor. The bright light illuminated the dark room as I opened my secure web browser. If my mother had initiated any sort of legal or financial maneuver against me, it would absolutely leave a digital paper trail. I logged into my premium credit monitoring service, placing my fingertips on the desk as the loading icon spun in a slow circle. In my line of work, a pristine credit score was my most valuable asset. The screen refreshed and the numbers appeared. My stomach dropped completely. My heart slammed against my ribs, echoing the pure panic that was suddenly flooding my entire system. My perfect 800 credit score had plummeted by more than 100 points in a matter of weeks. I clicked on the detailed report and scrolled frantically down the page, searching for the negative impact marker. There was a massive alert highlighted in red under the recent credit inquiries section. A commercial business loan had been originated precisely 3 weeks ago. The principal amount was $150,000. The loan was fully approved, and the funds had already been disbursed to an external corporate account. I stared at the screen, feeling the air leave my lungs completely. The unauthorized loan was firmly attached to my full legal name and my confidential personal social security number. Someone had taken out a 6-figure loan, leaving me responsible for the debt. My hands started to shake, but pure anger quickly overrode my panic. I navigated directly to the lending institution's online portal, using my credentials to pull the original application documents. I needed to see exactly how this catastrophic fraud had been executed. The loan application loaded on my screen and I scrutinized the data. The primary applicant was listed as myself, but the secondary contact email belonged to my mother. The physical mailing address used to bypass the initial verification process was my parents' suburban home. Beatrice had kept my physical social security card and my original birth certificate in a locked filing cabinet since I was a teenager. She had deliberately weaponized my childhood identification documents, bypassing security protocols to forge my signature on a massive guarantor application. The reality of her betrayal washed over me like a freezing winter wave. My own mother had not just favored Sierra over me. She had actively committed a severe federal felony to burden me with a mountain of debt. She was willing to completely destroy my financial future, my hard-earned career, and my entire livelihood just to arbitrarily secure a desperate bailout loan for her precious white son-in-law. She knew I would never willingly give Connor a single cent, so she decided to steal my identity and take the money by force. She believed she could saddle me with the debt and then use the resulting financial ruin to force me into selling my lake house to cover the payments. It was a sick and calculated plan designed to strip me of my independence and hand my assets over to her golden child. I pushed my chair back and paced across my office. I felt a terrifying level of intense, unbridled rage I had simply never experienced before in my life. This was no longer just a toxic family dynamic involving church gossip and blatant favoritism. This was a calculated criminal conspiracy. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone, ready to dial the Federal Fraud Department to report my mother for grand larceny and identity theft. But before I made the call, I looked back at the glowing computer screen. I needed to gather every single piece of evidence to ensure Beatrice could never talk her way out of this. I opened the loan disbursement record to see exactly where the $150,000 had been deposited. The funds were wired directly to a business checking account, registered under a corporate entity named Connor Management Solutions. I accessed the highly restricted State Business Registry database, searching for answers. I wanted to see the exact structure of the consulting firm I was supposedly funding with my stolen identity. I typed the corporate name into the search bar and waited for the official registration documents to populate. The results appeared on my screen, and I leaned in closer, squinting at the details. A glaring red flag immediately caught my attention. The tax identification number and the listed corporate officers did not align with any active commercial enterprise. I cross-referenced the business address listed on the state registry and found it was nothing more than an empty post office box in a rundown strip mall. I pulled up the annual revenue reports and the employee tax filings required by the state. The ledger was completely empty. There were no employees, and there was no actual revenue being generated. The entire enterprise was a hollow fabrication designed strictly to receive and funnel money. The truth hit me with staggering clarity. Connor's prestigious consulting firm was not just failing, it was completely fake. The company did not actually exist anywhere except on paper, and the enormous amount of money my mother had stolen for him was currently being secretly funneled directly into a massive, untraceable black hole. I realized with absolute certainty that this shocking and devastating discovery would be the exact weapon I desperately needed to orchestrate their complete and total downfall right now. I did not sleep a single wink that night. The glowing screen of my computer monitor burned the fraudulent loan details into my retinas. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was already dressed in a sharp-tailored suit and driving my car through the quiet streets of downtown Atlanta. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of my commercial brokerage firm and immediately dialed the one person I knew could unravel this entire criminal conspiracy. His name was Mitchell. I was a highly exclusive private investigator who specialized in deep background checks and corporate espionage for my most elite real estate clients. Mitchell was not the kind of man you hired to catch a cheating spouse. He was the kind of man you hired when you needed to completely dismantle a corrupt organization without leaving a single fingerprint behind. Mitchell answered on the first ring despite the early hour. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I told him I needed an immediate, comprehensive financial and criminal background check on my brother-in-law Connor. I securely forwarded the fake business registry documents and the fraudulent loan application my mother had submitted using my stolen identity. I explicitly instructed Mitchell to follow the money trail, no matter how deep it went or who it implicated. He assured me he would have a preliminary dossier ready within 48 hours and told me to act completely normal around my family until he uncovered the full scope of the situation. I agreed and spent the next 2 days functioning on pure adrenaline and cold, calculated rage. When Thursday afternoon finally arrived, my encrypted messaging application chimed with an urgent notification from Mitchell. He requested an immediate in-person meeting at a discreet private lounge located in the financial district. I cleared my afternoon schedule and drove straight to the location. Mitchell was already sitting in a dimly lit corner booth nursing a black coffee with a thick manila folder resting on the table in front of him. His expression was incredibly grim as I slid into the leather booth opposite him. He did not even bother offering a greeting before he opened the folder and slid a stack of highly classified financial documents toward me. "Morgan, you need to brace yourself," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your brother-in-law is not just a struggling consultant with a failing business. He is a professional con artist, and his entire life is a carefully constructed fabrication. Mitchell pointed to the first document which detailed Connor's family history. The old money generational wealth narrative that my mother constantly bragged about to her church friends was an absolute lie. Connor's family had been completely wiped out in a massive corporate bankruptcy back in 2012. They had lost their estates, their trust funds, and their social standing over a decade ago. Connor had been floating on an endless mountain of hidden credit card debt and predatory loans ever since. He wore expensive clothes and drove a luxury car that were both heavily financed through shell companies. I stared at the bankruptcy filings, feeling a sick sense of vindication mixing with profound disgust. My mother Beatrice had practically worshipped the ground Connor walked on simply because he was a well-spoken white man who played golf and projected an aura of elite privilege. She had actively weaponized his fake status to elevate her own standing in our affluent Black community, treating my hard-earned success as inferior to his imaginary wealth. Mitchell explained that Connor was a textbook predator who specifically targeted insecure families with deep pockets and a desperate need for social validation. He had identified Sierra as the perfect naive mark and recognized immediately that Beatrice would eagerly hand over the keys to the kingdom just to keep a white aristocrat in the family picture. But the deception went far deeper than just a fake trust fund and a predatory marriage. Mitchell turned the page to reveal a heavily redacted document bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My breath caught in my throat as I read the summary. Connor was currently the primary target of a massive covert federal investigation. Before moving to Atlanta, he had worked as a senior financial analyst for a major logistics firm in Chicago. Over a period of 3 years, he had systematically embezzled nearly $2 million from his former employers, funneling the stolen corporate funds into a complex web of offshore accounts. The federal agents had been quietly building a watertight case against him for wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and he knew the indictment was going to drop at any moment. That was the real reason he had suddenly lost his supposed consulting job and why he was pushing so aggressively to secure a permanent residence. How was completely out of cash and desperate to liquidize any asset he could get his hands on before the federal authorities froze everything he touched. I looked up at Mitchell, my mind racing to connect the final pieces of this catastrophic puzzle. If he is being investigated for federal embezzlement and he has no actual money, why does he need my lake house? So desperately, I asked, my voice trembling with the sheer magnitude of the situation. Why go through the trouble of having my mother steal my identity for a measly $150,000 loan when he clearly needs millions to escape? Mitchell leaned forward, tapping his finger against the final page of the dossier, because the $150,000 was just the operational cash he needed to finalize his exit strategy, Mitchell explained darkly. The lake house is the ultimate prize, Morgan. He does not want to live in it. He needs the physical deed to your property because it is a clean, fully paid $1 million asset with no current liens attached to it. His plan is to manipulate your mother into forcing you to sign over the property rights. Once the deed is legally transferred into his name, he intends to use the house as immediate collateral to secure a massive unregulated loan from private shadow lenders. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Connor never had any intention of raising his daughter in my home. He planned to leverage my property for a massive payout and then flee to a non-extradition country, leaving his criminal debt behind. He was going to completely abandon Sierra and Lily. I was going to let the private lenders seize the lake house, leaving my entire family homeless and financially destroyed, while I would be left bankrupt and paying off the fraudulent loan my mother took out in my name. The sheer evil of his endgame was paralyzing. The drive back to my office felt entirely surreal as the weight of the information settled heavily over my shoulders. Every cruel remark my mother had ever made about my independence and every smug look Connor had ever given me took on a horrifying new context. They were actively conspiring to dismantle my life while sitting at my dinner table and eating my food. My own mother was so thoroughly brainwashed by the allure of proximity to whiteness and old money that she was willing to sacrifice her own flesh and blood to sustain a complete illusion. I realized then that attempting to reason with her or simply exposing the fraud privately would never be enough. She would always find a way to justify her actions and protect him. I needed to ensure that when the truth finally came out, it would be so devastatingly public and legally binding that she could never rewrite the narrative again. I thanked Mitchell, paid his exorbitant invoice in full, and walked out of the lounge with the dossier clutched tightly in my hands. They thought they were playing a simple game of family manipulation, but they had unknowingly invited a federal fugitive into our lives. I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat staring blankly at the steering wheel. I was no longer just protecting my real estate. I was about to orchestrate the most spectacular federal takedown my mother and her precious son-in-law had ever seen. I sat in the driver's seat of my car outside the private lounge, letting the engine idle while the sheer gravity of Mitchell's dossier settled into my bones. The air conditioning did nothing to cool the burning rage radiating through my chest. My mother and her precious son-in-law were active federal criminals plotting to destroy my entire life to facilitate an international escape plan. Taking this information to the local police department right now would trigger a massive chaotic mess. The local detectives would likely just slap Beatrice with a basic identity theft charge and release her on bail. Connor would immediately realize his cover was blown, and he would use whatever remaining stolen cash he had to vanish across the border before the local authorities even communicated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I could not let that happen. A simple slap on the wrist was far too good for them. I wanted them to lose absolutely everything in the most spectacular and devastating way possible. I wanted Connor sitting in a federal penitentiary, and I wanted my mother to finally face the catastrophic consequences of her blind worship of a white con artist. I finally shifted the heavy car into gear and quickly pulled away from the curb. I was going straight to the federal authorities. I navigated through the heavy downtown Atlanta traffic and drove directly toward the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I parked my car in the visitor lot and walked through the heavy glass doors, carrying the thick manila folder Mitchell had prepared for me. I approached the front security desk and calmly stated that I had actionable intelligence regarding an ongoing corporate embezzlement investigation. The receptionist looked skeptical at first, but when I provided Connor's full legal name and referenced the specific logistics firm in Chicago, her entire demeanor changed instantly. I was escorted through multiple security checkpoints and placed into a sterile, windowless interrogation room. 10 minutes later, a tall, serious man walked into the room introducing himself as Special Agent Harrison. I was the lead investigator assigned to tracking down the missing $2 million Connor had stolen from his former employers. I sat across from him and laid out every single piece of evidence. I showed him the fake corporate registry documents, the empty post office box address, and the fraudulent loan application my mother had submitted using my stolen identity. I explained exactly how Connor was manipulating my family to secure the deed to my $1 million lake house so he could leverage it for shadow loans and flee the country. Special Agent Harrison listened intently, his eyes scanning the documents with sharp precision. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. He explained that his team had been tracking Connor for months, but they had lost his financial trail when he moved to Georgia and integrated himself into my mother's church community. Connor had been incredibly careful to keep his name off all local banking records, using Sierra as a shield for his daily expenses. My mother forging my signature for the $150,000 operational loan was the exact missing link the federal agents needed to prove he was actively engaged in ongoing money laundering and wire fraud. However, Special Agent Harrison warned me that building the final indictment and securing the federal warrants to freeze his hidden offshore accounts would take several weeks. If Connor suspected the feds were closing in, he would abandon my sister and disappear before they could lock down the stolen funds. The federal agents needed Connor to feel completely safe and victorious. They needed him to stay exactly where he was. I looked Special Agent Harrison dead in the eye and told him I knew exactly how to keep Connor anchored in Atlanta. I would become an active informant and deliver the ultimate bait. I drove back to my lake house as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across my pristine lawn. The house was quiet and empty, a stark contrast to the storm I was currently brewing. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I needed to execute a flawless performance of psychological warfare against my own mother. Beatrice thrived on submission, and she needed to believe she had finally broken my spirit. I pulled out my phone and opened my text message thread with her. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard as I carefully crafted the most difficult and strategic lie of my entire life. I had to swallow my pride and play the role of the defeated, exhausted daughter who simply could not fight the powerful family dynamic any longer. I typed out a long paragraph explaining that the stress of our ongoing conflict was ruining my mental health and affecting my real estate career. I told her I had accepted a highly lucrative out-of-state position and would be relocating permanently. Then I dropped the hook. I wrote that she had won, and I was willing to surrender the lake house to Sierra and Connor, just to keep the peace and move on with my life. I stared at the glowing text message, ensuring the tone hit the exact perfect note of resignation and defeat. I explicitly stated that I would personally bring the legal deed and the physical keys to Sierra's birthday party in exactly 2 months. I framed it as a gesture of family unity, knowing she would devour the opportunity to showcase her victory to the church congregation. I hit send and watched the message fly across the digital ether. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. Just minutes later, the screen illuminated with a reply from Beatrice. She replied that she always knew I would eventually do the right thing and fix my incredibly selfish attitude. She added that she would immediately begin planning a massive housewarming celebration for them. I stood in my empty kitchen reading the glowing message again, and a cold, ruthless smile slowly spread across my face. I knew right then that she had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. They all thought they had successfully manipulated me into surrendering my entire livelihood. They had no idea they were happily walking straight into a federal prison cell. The next 8 weeks were a masterclass in psychological endurance and silent preparation. I had to completely suppress every natural instinct. I had to defend myself, while my family publicly paraded their supposed victory across every social media platform they could access. She spent her entire days posting elaborate digital mood boards featuring my lake house. She uploaded detailed floor plans, showing exactly how she intended to gut my custom kitchen and replace my imported marble countertops with cheap, trendy fixtures. Every single post was accompanied by long, obnoxious captions about how blessed she was to have a husband who could provide such an incredible estate for their family. She never once mentioned my name or acknowledged that the property still legally belonged to me. Connor played his part perfectly as the benevolent, wealthy patriarch. He posted pictures of himself standing proudly by my private dock, holding a glass of bourbon, and talking about the burdens of managing large estates. He needed them to believe he had secured $1 million asset so they would not break his legs before he could flee the country. The sheer audacity of his performance made my blood boil. But I knew that every single photograph and location tag was just more evidence for the federal agents tracking his movements. Special Agent Harrison called me twice a week on a secure line to confirm that Connor had not attempted to purchase any international flight tickets. The illusion of the upcoming deed transfer was the only thing keeping him anchored in Atlanta. My mother, Beatrice, was perhaps the most sickening to watch during this 2-month waiting period. She completely monopolized the Sunday church services, using her prayer requests to loudly thank the Lord for blessing her son-in-law with a magnificent new property. She made sure every church elder and gossiping aunt knew that she had successfully forced her stubborn, selfish daughter to surrender her wealth for the good of the family. She was absolutely drunk on the perceived power she held over me. She thought she had finally broken my spirit and bent me to her will. While they were busy celebrating their fake real estate acquisition, I was meticulously executing the final stages of my trap. I hired a discreet private moving company to work exclusively during the graveyard shift. Over the course of 3 weeks, they carefully packed up every single piece of valuable artwork, designer furniture, and sensitive financial documentation I owned. I moved my entire life into a secure luxury high-rise apartment in the center of the financial district, leaving the lake house completely staged with cheap rental furniture. I also spent countless hours sitting in sterile conference rooms with my legal team and the federal investigators. We mapped out the exact sequence of events for the day of the party. Special Agent Harrison secured multiple arrest warrants for wire fraud. The local police department was also briefed and prepared to execute separate arrest warrants for my mother regarding the identity theft and bank fraud. Everything was perfectly aligned. All I had to do was walk into the lion den and deliver the final blow. The morning of the party finally arrived, bringing with it a thick, humid Georgia heat. I woke up in my new downtown apartment and checked my phone. Sierra had already posted a smug selfie standing right outside my front security gate. The caption read out with the old and in with the new because the keys are officially ours today. I dressed deliberately, choosing a sharp-tailored dark crimson suit that projected absolute authority. I looked in the mirror and promised myself that this would be the very last day these people would ever have the power to make me feel small. I drove my car down the familiar winding road toward the lake house. The street was absolutely packed with vehicles belonging to church members, extended relatives, and various people I did not even recognize. I later learned that Connor had invited several of his aggressive private creditors to the party to prove to them that he was taking possession of the estate today. They were standing around my front lawn wearing cheap suits and looking entirely out of place among the church ladies in their Sunday hats. A vinyl banner was strung reading, "Welcome to the new estate." I parked my car at the end of the driveway and grabbed the thick manila envelope resting on my passenger seat. The envelope did not contain a property deed. It contained the comprehensive credit reports, the fraudulent loan documents, and the federal background checks. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked slowly up the driveway, feeling the eyes of dozens of guests turning to watch me. The backyard was very lavishly catered with expensive floral arrangements. Connor was standing on the patio holding court with his shady creditors, while Sierra was busy showing off the rental furniture in the living room. My mother spotted me immediately. She broke away from a group of old church elders and marched straight toward me down the driveway. She was wearing a bright yellow dress and a massive matching hat, looking every bit the triumphant matriarch. She did not bother greeting me. Her eyes locked directly onto the manila envelope in my hands. "Oh my God, Morgan, you finally made it," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness for the benefit of the guests watching us. "Tell me you brought the legal transfer papers and the master keys, because Connor really needs to show the investors that the transition is fully complete today." I stopped walking and looked at her. The sheer greed radiating from her face was repulsive. She was right, practically vibrating with excitement, ready to snatch the envelope from my hands and hand it directly to a federal criminal. I gripped the envelope tighter and offered her a chilling, completely empty smile. "Oh, I brought all the paperwork, all right," I said, my voice carrying perfectly over the chatter of the party guests. "But we need to do this right now, Mom. Connor needs to make a formal announcement in front of everyone before I hand over a single document. I want the whole church to see exactly what kind of man he really is." My mother beamed, completely oblivious to the lethal trap closing around her. I sat at my desk as the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting a pale gray light across my office. The glowing computer screen had burned the fraudulent loan details into my retinas over the past several hours. But I had not blinked. Local cops would just slap my mother with an identity theft charge, and Connor would easily slip through the cracks using the stolen cash to vanish across the border. I reached for my phone and dialed a highly encrypted number belonging to Mitchell. Mitchell was a premier private investigator who specialized in deep corporate espionage for my highest-level luxury real estate clients. He was exactly the kind of man you called when you needed to systematically dismantle a corrupt enterprise without leaving a single fingerprint behind. He answered on the first ring, despite it being barely 6 in the morning. I told him I desperately needed an immediate and highly comprehensive financial excavation on my brother-in-law, Connor, and I securely forwarded the fake business registry documents, along with the fraudulent loan application my mother had submitted. I explicitly instructed Mitchell to follow the money trail no matter how deep it went or who it implicated. He assured me he would have a preliminary dossier ready within 48 hours and told me to maintain complete normalcy around my family until he uncovered the full scope of the situation. I agreed and spent the next 2 days functioning on pure adrenaline and rage. When Thursday afternoon finally arrived, my secure messaging application chimed with an urgent notification from Mitchell. He requested an immediate in-person meeting at a discreet private lounge deep in the financial district. I cleared my afternoon schedule and drove straight to the location. Mitchell was already sitting in a dimly lit corner booth, nursing a black coffee with a thick manila folder resting on the table. His expression was grim as I slid into the leather booth opposite him. He opened the folder and slid a stack of highly classified financial documents toward me. "Morgan, you need to brace yourself," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your brother-in-law is not just a struggling consultant with a failing business. He is a professional con artist, and his entire life is a carefully constructed fabrication." Mitchell pointed to the first document, which detailed Connor's family history. The old money generational wealth narrative that my mother constantly bragged about to her church friends was an absolute lie. Connor's family had been completely wiped out in a corporate bankruptcy back in 2012. They had lost their estates, their trust funds, and their social standing over a decade ago. Connor had been floating on an endless mountain of hidden credit card debt and predatory loans ever since. I stared at the bankruptcy filings, feeling a sick sense of vindication mixing with profound disgust. My mother Beatrice had worshipped the ground. Connor walked on simply because he was a well-spoken white man who played golf and projected an aura of elite privilege. She had actively weaponized his fake status to elevate her own standing in our affluent black community, treating my hard-earned success as inferior to his imaginary wealth. Mitchell explained that Connor was a textbook predator who specifically targeted insecure families with deep pockets and a desperate need for social validation. He had identified Sierra as the perfect naive mark and recognized immediately that Beatrice would eagerly hand over the keys to the kingdom. But the deception went far deeper than just a fake trust fund and a predatory marriage. Mitchell turned the page to reveal a heavily redacted document bearing the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My breath caught in my throat as I read the summary. Connor was the primary target of a massive covert federal investigation. Before moving to Atlanta, he had worked as a senior financial analyst for a major logistics firm in Chicago. Over 3 years, he had systematically embezzled nearly $2 million from his former employers, funneling the stolen corporate funds into a complex web of offshore accounts. The federal agents had been quietly building a watertight case against him for wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. The walls were closing in on him, and he knew the indictment was going to drop at any moment. That was the real reason he had suddenly lost his supposed consulting job and why he was pushing so aggressively to secure a permanent residence. He was completely out of cash and desperate to liquidize any asset he could get his hands on before the federal authorities froze everything he touched. I looked up at Mitchell, connecting the final pieces of this puzzle. If he is being investigated for federal embezzlement and has no money, why does he need my lake house so desperately? I asked, my voice trembling. Why go through the trouble of having my mother steal my identity for a $150,000 loan when he clearly needs millions to escape? Mitchell leaned forward, tapping his finger against the final page of the dossier. Because that loan was just the operational cash he needed to finalize his exit strategy, he explained darkly. The lake house is the ultimate prize, Morgan. He needs the physical deed to your property because it is a clean, fully paid $1 million asset. His plan is to manipulate your mother into forcing you to sign over the property rights. Once the deed is legally transferred into his name, he intends to use the house as immediate collateral to secure a massive unregulated loan from private shadow lenders. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Connor never had any real intention of raising his young daughter in my home. He planned to leverage my property for a massive payout and then flee to a non-extradition country, leaving his criminal debt behind. He was going to abandon Sierra and Lily. He was going to let the private lenders seize the lake house, leaving my entire family homeless and financially destroyed, while I would be left bankrupt and paying off the fraudulent loan my mother took out. The sheer, undeniable evil of his calculated endgame was absolutely paralyzing. I knew I had to destroy him. I remained frozen in the driver's seat of my car, long after the private investigator had disappeared down the busy city street. The heavy manila folder he had given me sat on the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. The streetlights above flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows across the leather interior of my vehicle. My initial instinct was blind rage, I wanted to slam my foot on the gas pedal, drive directly to the local police precinct, and throw those fraudulent loan documents onto the duty sergeant's desk. I wanted to see my mother handcuffed for identity theft right then and there. I wanted to watch the local cops drag her out of her pristine suburban home in front of all her judgmental church friends while she cried and begged for mercy. But as my breathing slowly steadied, my corporate finance instincts kicked in, overriding my raw emotional panic. I began to process the sheer scale of the reality sitting in the folder next to me. Local police would treat this as a simple domestic dispute involving stolen credit and family drama. My mother would inevitably play the tearful victim, claiming it was a simple misunderstanding about a shared bank account. The local judge would likely give her a slap on the wrist, or basic probation, because she was an older woman with no criminal record. More importantly, a localized small-scale police investigation would immediately tip off Connor. He was not just a lazy brother-in-law, he was a professional federal fugitive who had already stolen millions. The exact moment he sensed local authorities sniffing around his fake consulting firm, he would drain that $150,000 loan and vanish across the international border. He would leave my sister completely stranded and my mother facing the legal fallout alone, while he lived comfortably in a non-extradition country, sipping drinks on a beach. Local justice was far too small for the magnitude of their betrayal. Calling the local cops was too good for them. I did not just want them arrested and embarrassed. I wanted to utterly dismantle their suffocating arrogance. I wanted Connor to spend the next 2 decades rotting inside a federal penitentiary where his fake white privilege could not save him. I wanted my mother to realize she had sacrificed her actual hardworking daughter to harbor a highly wanted criminal. I started the engine and merged into the heavy evening traffic, heading in the complete opposite direction of the local precinct. I drove straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office, located in the dense financial heart of the city. The massive concrete building looked intimidating and cold against the night sky, but I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors with absolute certainty. The security guards in the lobby looked surprised to see a woman in a tailored business suit clutching a thick dossier at this late hour. I approached the bulletproof glass at the reception desk and stated calmly that I had direct, actionable documentary evidence regarding an ongoing federal embezzlement fugitive. When I spoke Connor's real legal name, the receptionist immediately picked up a red secure telephone. Within 10 minutes, I was escorted through a complex maze of sterile hallways and heavy electronic doors into a windowless interrogation room. A tall man in a dark gray suit entered shortly after introducing himself as Special Agent Miller. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or emotional tears. I opened the folder and spread the financial documents across the cold metal table. I walked him through the entire corporate structure of Connor's fake consulting firm. I showed him exactly how the fraudulent $150,000 loan taken out under my stolen Social Security number was funneled directly into a shell company registered to a vacant dirt lot. Agent Miller remained entirely silent as he reviewed the paperwork. When he finally looked, his expression had shifted from polite skepticism to intense predatory focus. He explained that the federal authorities had been tracking the missing $2 million from Chicago for nearly a year, but Connor had gone completely off the grid when he moved south and married into my family. My mother stealing my identity to secure that business loan was the exact fatal mistake the federal agents needed to tie him to active wire fraud across state lines. Agent Miller warned me that building the full federal indictment and freezing the hidden offshore accounts would require at least a month of covert surveillance. They needed Connor to remain totally confident that his scheme was working perfectly. If he suspected anyone was onto him, he would run before they could lock down the stolen corporate funds. I looked the federal agent directly in the eyes and volunteered to become an active confidential informant. I promised to feed them every detail of his movements and deliver him to them on a silver platter. The drive back to my lake house felt entirely different than the drive into the city. The suffocating panic had been replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. I pulled into my driveway and stared at the dark, beautiful house that I had worked so relentlessly to buy. My mother and Connor believed this property was their ultimate prize. They believed they could simply exhaust me into surrendering my sanctuary through psychological warfare and church gossip. I walked through the front door and turned on the kitchen lights. The house was completely silent. I poured myself a glass of cold water and placed my phone on the granite countertop. I needed to execute the most difficult psychological performance of my entire life. I needed to convince a deeply narcissistic woman that she had successfully broken her own daughter's spirit. My mother thrived on absolute submission. She needed to feel dominant and victorious over me. I opened my text message application and selected her name. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard for a long moment before I began typing. I deliberately crafted the message to sound pathetic and defeated, knowing she would eagerly feed on the vulnerability. I wrote that I was exhausted and crying alone in the dark. I told her that the constant family fighting was destroying my mental health and interfering with my real estate career. I typed the exact words she desperately wanted to hear. "You win, Mum, I cannot fight the family anymore." I added that I was accepting a new corporate job in another state and moving away to start over because I was so depressed. Then I laid the ultimate bait. I wrote that I would legally sign the lake house deed over to Sierra and Connor at Sierra's upcoming birthday party next month. I framed it as a final desperate peace offering to make amends for my supposed selfish behavior. I read over the message 3 times, ensuring every single sentence radiated total surrender. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, perfectly tailored to my mother's massive ego. I pressed send and watched the text bubble appear on the screen. I did not move from the kitchen island. I simply stood there watching the dark screen of my phone. I knew she would not wait long to respond because she would be too eager to claim her victory. Less than 2 minutes later, the screen illuminated with a loud chime. The notification displayed a new message from Beatrice. I opened the application and read her response. "I always knew you would do the right thing and fix your attitude." She did not offer a single word of maternal comfort regarding my supposed mental health struggles or my tearful surrender. She did not care that I was supposedly leaving the state in tears. She only cared that she had won the property and secured her false aristocratic narrative for her church friends. A cold, ruthless smile stretched across my face as I locked the phone and set it face down on the marble counter. The steel jaws of the federal trap had just snapped shut around them. They were going to spend the next month happily planning a massive celebratory party, while I spent the next month orchestrating their absolute destruction. The next 60 days required a level of emotional detachment that I never knew I possessed. After sending that text message of total surrender to my mother, I had to completely commit to the role of the broken, defeated daughter. It was not just about acting sad on the few brief phone calls I allowed myself to answer. It was about maintaining complete radio silence while they publicly gloated. My mother wasted zero time initiating her grand takeover. Within 48 hours of my text, she had already mailed out heavy cardstock invitations to the entire congregation, announcing a dual celebration for Sierra's birthday and the official transfer of the family estate. Reading those words printed in elegant gold foil made my stomach churn, but it also fueled the cold fire burning inside me. They were so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need to elevate Connor that they never stopped to question why a woman who fought tooth and nail for her independence would suddenly hand over her most valuable asset without a legal fight. They simply assumed they had worn me down through sheer emotional exhaustion. They believed their toxic dynamic was a force of nature that no one could resist forever. My silence was interpreted as absolute surrender, and they happily rushed to claim the spoils of a war they thought they had already won. While they were busy selecting catering menus and ordering massive floral arrangements for my backyard, I was carefully dismantling my life at the lake house piece by piece. I could not risk them dropping by unannounced and finding the property completely empty, so I orchestrated a highly sophisticated shell game. I hired a boutique staging company that specialized in high-end real estate transitions. Working entirely in the dead of night, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, we systematically replaced all of my authentic imported Italian leather sofas, custom oak dining tables, and original contemporary artwork with convincing but cheap visual replicas. My real belongings, along with every single piece of sensitive financial documentation and personal memorabilia, were discreetly transported to a secure luxury penthouse suite I had leased in the heart of the city. The physical exhaustion of moving my entire life under the cover of darkness was nothing compared to the mental stamina required to keep the secret. Every time my mother texted me demanding to know if I had hired a professional cleaning service to prepare the house for its new owners, I had to bite my tongue until it bled. I politely replied that everything would be spotless and ready for their grand arrival. By the end of the third week, the lake house was nothing more than a beautiful hollow movie set waiting for its final scene. Standing in that staged living room, feeling the cheap synthetic fabric of the fake couch under my fingertips, I realized how perfectly the house now mirrored the people who were about to inherit it. The hardest part of the waiting game was enduring the absolute delusion broadcasting across my social media feeds every single day. Sierra and Connor had completely abandoned any pretense of humility. Sierra created a public digital renovation diary that she updated constantly. She posted highly detailed rendering videos, showing how she planned to completely gut my chef kitchen, tearing out the rare Brazilian marble countertops I had flown to Europe to select and replacing them with basic builder-grade granite that she deemed more modern. She posted pictures of my serene master bathroom with lengthy captions complaining about the fixtures and outlining her plans to demolish the soaking tub to make room for a massive vanity. Connor was even worse. He started posting stylized photographs of himself standing on my private dock, smoking expensive cigars that he bought using my stolen credit identity. His captions were sickening diatribes about the burdens of generational wealth and how hard he worked to secure such a magnificent property for his wife and child. He was actively using my home as a prop to pacify his shadow lenders, projecting an image of total financial dominance while secretly preparing to leverage the deed and flee the country the moment my signature hit the paper. He even had the audacity to tag high-end luxury car dealerships in his posts, subtly hinting that his next purchase would be a new sports car to match his new million-dollar driveway. The sheer brazenness of their public performance was staggering, but I collected every single digital post, every arrogant photograph, and every bragging comment, and forwarded them directly to the federal agents building his profile. My mother Beatrice was the conductor of this circus of delusion. She treated Sunday church services like her own personal press conferences. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard exactly how she was portraying the situation. She stood up during prayer requests and openly wept crocodile tears, thanking the heavens that her stubborn eldest daughter had finally seen the light and recognized the rightful hierarchy of the family. She spun a masterful narrative painting herself as the patient matriarch who had successfully guided her lost sheep back to the flock. Meanwhile, I was spending those exact same Sunday mornings, sitting in heavily guarded federal conference rooms with Special Agent Miller and his team of forensic accountants. We mapped out the precise timeline for the day of the party down to the minute. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had successfully traced the fraudulent $150,000 loan directly to a hidden offshore holding account controlled entirely by Connor. They had everything they needed for a multi-count federal indictment, including wire fraud, identity theft, and interstate embezzlement. Local authorities had also finalized the arrest warrants for my mother regarding the forgery of my social security number. The snare was completely assembled, hidden just beneath the leaves. Agent Miller walked me through the tactical logistics of the takedown. Undercover agents would be stationed in unmarked vehicles disguised as catering vans and utility trucks parked along the perimeter of the lake house property. They just needed me to get Connor to publicly acknowledge the fraudulent loan and his ownership of the shell company in front of the guests to seal the final layer of intent. It was a dangerous game of verbal chess, but I was ready to play. The morning of the party broke with a sharp, clear blue sky. The weather was absolutely flawless, as if the universe itself was mocking the storm that was about to hit. I woke up in my new downtown penthouse and poured a single cup of black coffee. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. I picked it up and opened the social media application. Sierra had just posted a new photograph. It was a selfie taken right outside the wrought iron security gates of the lake house. She was wearing a bright designer dress holding a massive balloon bouquet with Connor standing smugly over her shoulder. The caption read out with the old and in with the new, because the keys are officially ours today. I stared at the glowing screen, reading those arrogant words over and over again. They truly believed they had won. They believed they had conquered me. I set the phone down and walked into my walk-in closet to select my armor for the day. I chose a tailored emerald green suit that commanded absolute authority. I was not going to attend a birthday party. I was going to attend an execution. I grabbed the thick leather portfolio containing the fake transfer documents the federal agents had prepared for me as a prop. I walked out to my car and started the engine, feeling the low rumble vibrate through the steering wheel. Today was the day the illusion shattered permanently. Today my mother would learn exactly what happens when you sacrifice your own flesh and blood to protect a parasite. The drive to the lake house took exactly 42 minutes, but it felt like traversing an entirely different dimension. I kept my hands steady on the leather steering wheel, feeling the heavy weight of the manila envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. As I turned onto my private road, the sheer scale of their delusion became immediately visible. Vehicles were parked haphazardly along both sides of the street, stretching all the way down to the main intersection. There were practical minivans belonging to the church choir members, expensive SUVs leased by my mother's, gossiping friends, and a striking number of dark unmarked sedans that looked entirely out of place in this quiet suburban sanctuary. I slowly navigated through the maze of badly parked cars until I reached the wrought iron security gates of my own property. The gates were propped wide open, welcoming anyone and everyone into my sanctuary. Strung across the massive stone pillars at the entrance was a professionally printed vinyl banner that stretched at least 15 feet across. The bold navy blue letters read, "Welcome to Sierra and Connor's Lake Estate." Looking at those words printed so arrogantly across my own property line sent a sharp thrill of adrenaline straight into my veins. I bypassed the crowded street parking and pulled my car directly up the long paved driveway, parking right near the front entrance where the catering vans were unloading. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet air-conditioned cabin for one final moment. I picked up the thick leather portfolio, unzipped it, and pulled out the large manila envelope. It was heavy, packed with federal indictments, banking records, and undeniable proof of multiple felonies. I took a slow, deep breath, stepped out of the vehicle and into the suffocating Georgia heat. The front lawn was swarming with people. My mother had apparently invited half the congregation, and they were all dressed in their Sunday best, holding expensive appetizers and chatting excitedly. But sprinkled among the pastel dresses and neat button-down shirts was a completely different demographic. There were groups of hard-looking men wearing ill-fitting dark suits standing in tense clusters near the edge of the property. They were not making small talk. Their eyes darted around the estate, assessing the value of the landscaping, the architecture, and the vehicles. These were Connor's shadow lenders. These were the desperate, dangerous creditors he owed a massive fortune to, and they had clearly shown up to ensure their investment was secured. Seeing them standing on my manicured lawn next to oblivious church elders eating bacon-wrapped scallops was a surreal masterpiece of completely unchecked fraud. I had barely taken 5 steps toward the front door when my mother intercepted me. She must have been watching the driveway like a hawk waiting for her prize to arrive. She was wearing an extravagant peach-colored silk suit with a string of heavy pearls marching down the paved walkway with the aggressive confidence of a conquering general. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about the new job I had tearfully lied about taking out of state. She did not even offer a fake maternal hug for the benefit of the watching crowd. Her sharp, dark eyes dropped instantly to the manila envelope tightly gripped in my right hand. "Morgan, you are late," she snapped, her voice low and frantic, cutting through the sounds of the party. "Everyone has been waiting for nearly an hour. Connor has very important financial backers here today, and he needs to show them the executed transfer documents right now to finalize his portfolio transition. Hand me the deed so I can take it to him." She reached her hand out, her manicured fingers twitching with naked greed, expecting me to simply surrender my entire life savings right there on the concrete driveway. I looked at her outstretched hand and then up at her impatient face. I let a perfectly crafted look of sad reluctance wash over my features, playing the role of the defeated daughter, one last time. "Mom, I cannot just hand over legal property documents in the driveway, I said, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. The lawyers said Connor and Sierra both have to formally accept the transfer in person. I brought everything just like you asked, but we have to do it properly. My mother let out a loud, exasperated sigh, rolling her eyes, as if my adherence to legal property transfer was just another annoying character flaw she had to endure. Fine, she hissed, turning on her heel. But hurry up and stop dragging your feet. The investors are getting restless and Connor needs to close this chapter today. I followed her through the heavy wooden front doors and stepped into the grand foyer of my home. The visual contrast was jarring. The boutique staging company had done a flawless job stripping the soul out of my house. The cheap rental furniture sat awkwardly in the massive living room, looking sterile and hollow. Sierra was holding court near the fake fireplace, completely oblivious to the downgraded decor. She was holding a glass of expensive champagne, laughing loudly with her friends, and pointing out the load-bearing walls she planned to tear down next week. She did not even notice me walk past. I continued following my mother through the sprawling house and out through the glass French doors onto the massive back patio. The backyard was a scene of absolute excess. A massive white tent had been erected near the private dock, housing a full premium bar and a carving station. A live jazz trio was playing softly in the corner. Connor was standing near the edge of the water, surrounded by three of the aggressive-looking men in dark suits. He was sweating visibly despite the light breeze coming off the lake. His smile was tight and nervous, and his hands kept gesturing wildly toward the house as if offering it up as a physical sacrifice to appease them. As soon as my mother stepped onto the patio, she caught Connor's eye and pointed triumphantly toward me. Connor's gaze locked onto the thick manila envelope in my hands, and a wave of pure, unfiltered relief washed over his face. He actually closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, exhaling a long breath. He thought he had won. He thought his escape route had just been delivered on a silver platter. He quickly murmured something to the dangerous men flanking him, and they all turned to look at me like wolves watching a wounded deer limp into a clearing. I walked slowly into the center of the lavishly catered backyard, feeling the eyes of every single guest tracking my movements. The church members smiled encouragingly, thinking they were witnessing a beautiful moment of family reconciliation. The shadow lenders watched with cold calculation, waiting for their collateral to be secured. I stood perfectly still near the edge of the stone patio, gripping the envelope. Connor broke away from his creditors and marched toward the center of the yard, his confidence fully restored. He grabbed a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter and picked up a silver butter knife. He tapped the heavy metal blade against the crystal glass, creating a sharp, ringing sound that sliced through the jazz music and the party chatter. The yard slowly fell silent as dozens of faces turned toward him. Connor flashed a blinding, predatory smile, wrapping his free arm around Sierra's waist as she hurried over to join him. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate our new beginning." He projected his voice, carrying clearly across the quiet lawn. "But before we toast to this beautiful estate, my incredibly generous sister-in-law has a very special announcement she needs to make." Connor held out the silver microphone toward me, his hand perfectly steady and his smile practically blinding in the afternoon sun. The jazz trio had stopped playing mid-note, leaving a heavy, expectant silence hanging over the manicured lawn. The cool metal of the microphone handle felt heavy as I took it from him. His fingers briefly brushed against mine, and I could feel the slight clamminess of his skin, a physical manifestation of his underlying desperation. He stepped back, wrapping his arm around Sierra's waist again, pulling her close as if they were the perfect royal couple waiting to officially inherit their kingdom. I looked out over the sea of faces gathered in my backyard. There were at least 80 people standing on the grass, holding crystal champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. I saw the elderly women from the church choir, sitting in the shaded patio chairs, their faces arranged in identical expressions of polite anticipation. I saw Desmond, the senior head deacon, standing near the carving station holding a glass of dark bourbon. I saw my mother, Beatrice, standing front and center, her chest puffed out with absolute triumph. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her eyes locked hungrily onto the thick manila envelope I was holding against my side. Behind the polite church crowd, the cluster of aggressive-looking men in ill-fitting suits stood in stony silence, their predatory gaze fixed entirely on me. They were the shadow lenders waiting for the deed transfer that would legally secure their unregulated millions. They thought they were watching a surrender, but they were actually the primary audience for an execution. I raised the microphone to my lips. The speakers crackled slightly, sending a sharp echo across the water of the lake behind us. Thank you all for coming today to my home. I began, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional tremor. My mother has spent the last several weeks telling everyone in our community that today marks a beautiful transition for our family. She told you that I was moving away and generously signing over this $1 million estate to my sister Sierra and her husband Connor to help them establish their new life. I paused, letting the words sink into the quiet crowd. Several of the church elders nodded approvingly, murmuring their support for such a selfless act of sisterly devotion. Beatrice beamed, a massive, self-satisfied grin stretching across her face. She actually reached out and patted Connor's arm, a gesture of maternal pride that made my stomach physically turn. But a house is not just a building. I continued, my voice projecting clearly through the professional sound system my mother had rented. A house is built on a foundation of trust, of financial transparency, and of family loyalty. And my mother is absolutely right about one thing. Today is about transparency. Today is about showing everyone exactly what kind of foundation this family is currently operating on. I shifted my grip on the microphone and slowly unfastened the metal clasp of the manila envelope. The sound of the thick paper tearing open seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet yard. Beatrice shifted her weight, her smile faltering just a fraction of an inch. She expected me to pull out a single legal document, a notarized property deed transferring the title. Instead, I pulled out a massive stack of heavily stapled financial records, bank statements, and federal investigative reports. The stack was nearly 2 inches thick. I saw Connor's eyes dart toward the papers, his brow furrowing in sudden sharp confusion. The relaxed, arrogant posture he had been maintaining instantly vanished. He dropped his arm from Sierra's waist and took a half step forward, his eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers visible on the top page. "Mom, you wanted me to hand over the papers," I said, my voice echoing across the lawn with absolute lethal precision. "Here is the $150,000 fraudulent loan you took out in my name to fund a criminal." The words hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. For 2 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The silence was so profound, I could hear the water lapping against the wooden pilings of my private dock. Then the entire yard erupted into chaos. Desmond, the senior deacon, dropped his heavy crystal glass directly onto the stone patio. The sharp crash of shattering glass broke the spell. The church gossips gasped collectively, hands flying to their mouths in absolute horror. Whispers tore through the crowd like a sudden violent wind. The group of shadow lenders at the back of the lawn suddenly stiffened their posture, shifting from relaxed observation to immediate aggressive tension. They looked at Connor, and then looked at the thick stack of financial documents in my hand, their calculating minds instantly realizing their guaranteed collateral was completely evaporating. Beatrice's face drained of all color. The vibrant peach silk suit she was wearing suddenly looked like a clown costume against her ashen skin. The triumphant matriarchal pride that had defined her entire existence simply dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman. She let out a strangled, gasping sound and lunged forward, her manicured hands grasping wildly for the microphone. "Morgan, stop it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "What are you doing? Give me that microphone right now." She stumbled over the edge of the stone patio, the heavy string of pearls bouncing wildly against her chest. I easily took a step back, keeping the microphone well out of her reach. "She is lying," Beatrice screamed, turning frantically toward the crowd of horrified church members. "My daughter is a jealous, bitter liar. She is having a mental breakdown. She does not know what she is saying. Do not listen to her." She reached for the thick stack of papers in my hand, but I pulled them away, holding them high enough for everyone to see the official banking seals printed across the top pages. "I have the forged signatures right here, Mom." I projected over the speakers, easily drowning out her frantic stammering. I have the complete paper trail showing exactly how you stole my social security number to secure a fraudulent business loan. I have the routing numbers proving you funneled that stolen cash directly into a fake consulting firm to protect a man who has been lying to you since the day you met him. Sierra started crying, a high-pitched, confused wailing sound. She looked from me to our mother and then up at Connor, begging someone to explain what was happening. But Connor was not looking at Sierra. He was staring at me, his face a mask of absolute, terrified comprehension. He realized in that exact moment that the game was entirely over. The fake aristocratic background, the stolen credit, the elaborate escape plan to flee the country, it was all burning to ash right in front of his shadow lenders. He took a slow, terrified step backward toward the lake, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit gates. I stepped away from my mother, completely ignoring her continued hysterical screaming. I leveled my gaze entirely on the man who had orchestrated this entire pathetic destruction of my family. The crowd fell dead silent again, sensing that the true execution was only just beginning. I raised the microphone one final time, making sure every single person in that yard, especially the dangerous men in the cheap suits, heard my next words. But Mom's felony is nothing compared to yours, Connor. But Mom's felony is nothing compared to yours, Connor. I kept the heavy metal microphone locked in my grip and turned my body fully toward him. The silence in the backyard was absolute and suffocating. Even the light breeze coming off the lake seemed to have stopped dead in its tracks. Connor was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling erratically beneath his expensive tailored suit. "That suit is a complete lie," I said, projecting my voice, so every single person on the sprawling green lawn could hear the clinical precision of my words. "The imported Cuban cigars you smoke on my private dock are a lie. The luxury vehicles you post on your social media feeds bragging about generational wealth are a lie. You have spent the last 12 months parading around our community, pretending to be a wealthy financial consultant from a prestigious aristocratic family, but you are nothing more than a glorified thief on the run from federal authorities." I opened the thick stack of papers in my hand and pulled out a certified bank ledger, holding it up in the bright afternoon sun, so the official Federal Bureau of Investigation watermark was visible. "Let us talk about the missing $2 million that magically evaporated from the Chicago corporate accounts you managed 18 months ago." I continued, letting the numbers echo over the rented speaker system. "Let us talk about the elaborate maze of shell companies you created to wash that stolen pension money before you fled the northern jurisdiction and married my desperate sister." I read the names of his fake corporations one by one, my voice steady and relentless. Apex Global Holdings, Meridian Consulting Group, Vanguard Capital Strategies. Every single one of them is an empty shell registered to vacant dirt lots and abandoned strip malls in the middle of nowhere. You use those fake entities to drain your previous employer's retirement funds, completely destroying the lives of hardworking people. And when the federal auditors finally started asking questions, you packed your bags and ran to Georgia, looking for a gullible, insecure family to hide behind so you could launder the rest of the cash. My mother gasped loudly behind me, a wet, choking sound, but I did not turn around to acknowledge her. My eyes were locked entirely on Connor. His face had turned the color of wet chalk. The arrogant, predatory smirk that he always wore like a crown had completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, small, desperate man. He looked wildly around the yard, searching the perimeter for an escape route, but the wrought iron gates were completely blocked by the massive crowd of stunned wedding guests and confused church elders. "But the worst part of your pathetic scheme, Connor," I said, lowering the microphone slightly, so my voice became a lethal growl, "is that you got greedy and impatient. You did not just steal from corporate pension funds, did you? You borrowed heavily from dangerous people who do not use the legal court system to collect their debts." I raised my free hand and pointed directly at the cluster of aggressive-looking men in the ill-fitting dark suits standing near the catering tent. The crowd of church members physically parted like the Red Sea as people scrambled away from them in sudden terror. "My mother told all her church friends that these men were your elite private investors," I announced, scanning the stony faces of the shadow lenders. Sierra told her thousands of social media followers that they were your venture capital partners, flying in from out of state to celebrate your new real estate portfolio. But we all know the dark truth, do we not? These men are the unregulated shadow lenders you scam to maintain your fake wealthy lifestyle. They are the desperate, violent creditors who tracked you down because you owe them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you promised them you were getting the legal deed to this $1 million estate today to finally settle your massive debts. The men in the dark suits did not move a muscle, but their cold, calculating eyes shifted from me to Connor with absolute lethal intent. The realization of his complete and total exposure finally snapped the last remaining threads of Connor's fragile sanity. The polished, suave, sophisticated facade that he had used to charm my mother and seduce my sister shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the entire congregation. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling hand and crashed onto the hard stone patio, sending sharp shards of glass exploding across the ground. He began sweating profusely, large, ugly droplets running down his forehead and rapidly soaking into the starched white collar of his expensive shirt. "Shut up!" he screamed, his voice cracking with raw panic and feral fury. "Shut your mouth, you lying, bitter woman!" He lunged forward a few steps, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. Backed into a corner with his entire fake life burning to ash, his true colors finally emerged. The deep-seated bigotry and racial superiority he had always masked behind polite Southern charm violently erupted for everyone to witness. "You are just a jealous, angry black woman who cannot stand to see her sister happy," he yelled, spittle flying from his pale lips. "You are a miserable ghetto hood rat, pretending to be high class, and you are making up these psychotic lies because you are obsessed with destroying my reputation." "Get her out of here," he bellowed, turning wildly toward the two massive private security guards my mother had hired to work the front gate. "I said get this trash off my property right now. She is trespassing and she is ruining my event." A collective gasp of horror rippled through the predominantly African-American church crowd. Desmond, the senior deacon, dropped his jaw in absolute disgust. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably on the grass, clutching her heavy pearl necklace, unable to process the monster she had welcomed into our home. Sierra was frozen in place, staring at her husband with wide, terrified eyes, as if he were a complete stranger. The two large security guards wearing black polo shirts began jogging across the lawn toward me, their expressions tense and uncertain. As they closed the distance, I did not retreat a single inch. I stood my ground firmly on the edge of the stone patio and brought the microphone right back to my lips. "Stop right there," I commanded, and the sheer dominant authority in my voice made both guards freeze in their tracks, just 5 feet away from me. "You are going to want to listen to me very carefully, gentlemen, because if you lay a single hand on me, you will be the ones leaving this estate in handcuffs. Connor is ordering you to remove me from his property, but this is not his property. It has never been his property, and it never will be." I reached deep into the thick manila envelope and pulled out the crisp, heavy parchment of the original property deed with the shiny gold county seal stamped firmly in the top corner. I held it up high for the security guards, the shadow lenders, and the entire horrified congregation to see clearly in the sunlight. "My mother told you all that I was coming here today to sign this beautiful lake house over to Connor and Sierra," I said, my voice ringing with absolute undeniable dominance over the yard. "She told you I surrendered to their demands and was moving away. But that was a carefully orchestrated trap, and you all walked right into it, blind and consumed by your own greed. Look at the signature line, Connor. Look at the legally registered owner. My name is the only name on this deed. Morgan Wilson. I own the land you are currently standing on. I own the private dock you smoke your stolen cigars on. I own the roof over your pathetic head. You do not own a single blade of grass in this entire state. You are a squatter, a federal fugitive, and a massive fraud. I am not trespassing, Connor. You are trespassing on my estate." The words struck him like physical blows to the chest. The shadow lenders at the back of the yard began advancing slowly across the lawn, their faces dark with unrestrained fury as they realized the deed was never transferring to them and their guaranteed collateral was a complete fantasy. Connor looked at the advancing dangerous men and then looked back at the official deed in my raised hand. His chest heaved as a wild animalistic panic consumed his final rational thoughts. He realized the federal agents were probably already waiting just outside the gates. He realized his offshore escape money was completely locked down. He realized he had absolutely nothing left in the world but the thick envelope in my hand. With a guttural scream of pure feral desperation, Connor lowered his head and lunged across the stone patio, throwing his entire body weight directly at me to tear the envelope from my grip and see the final documents for himself. Connor threw his entire body weight toward me, his hands grasping wildly for the manila envelope like a starving man reaching for a lifeline. I did not even flinch or step back. I simply shifted my shoulders, letting his own reckless momentum carry him forward past me. He stumbled hard, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the rough stone patio. He crashed to his knees with a sickening thud, the heavy envelope sliding from my fingers and scattering its contents across the ground. Connor scrambled frantically on all fours, scraping his palms against the concrete to gather the scattered pages. His eyes darted violently across the thick legal text, searching desperately for any loophole, any sign that the deed had actually been transferred to his name. But as he read the stark, undeniable clauses maintaining my absolute ownership, the last shred of his arrogant facade disintegrated. His chest began to heave in rapid, shallow gasps, and a low, guttural sound of pure panic rattled in his throat. At the edge of the lawn, the Shadowlenders did not say a single word or make a single threat. They simply stepped forward, in perfect, terrifying synchronization, moving away from the catering tent and closing the distance toward the patio. Their patience was entirely exhausted, their investment completely evaporated. The tallest man in the dark suit reached inside his jacket, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a wave of freezing terror straight into Connor's veins. Backed into a corner with violent men closing in, and his fake empire reduced to ash right in front of the entire congregation, Connor did what parasites always do when the host dies. He immediately looked for a new host to sacrifice to save his own skin. He scrambled backward, crab walking across the stone patio until his back hit the cold metal legs of the rented catering table. His eyes darted wildly across the horrified crowd of church elders, extended family, and wedding guests before locking dead onto my mother. Beatrice was still standing frozen on the grass, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her heavy pearl necklace, unable to process the destruction of her carefully curated world. Connor pointed a shaking, sweat-slicked finger directly at her chest. His voice when he spoke was no longer the smooth, cultured baritone he had used to charm his way into our family and local society. It was a high-pitched, feral shriek of pure, unrestrained self-preservation. "Do not look at me!" He screamed, his voice cracking as he frantically tried to redirect the predatory gaze of his dangerous creditors toward the woman who had worshipped him. "I did not take that loan. I did not forge her signature. The old fool did it herself." The words hit my mother like physical blows, staggering her backward. But Connor was not finished. He was desperate to deflect the violent consequences of his fraud, and he was completely willing to burn Beatrice down to the foundation to do it. "She was obsessed with me!" he yelled, spittle flying from his pale lips, as he pointed accusingly at the matriarch who had given him everything. She was so desperate to have a wealthy son-in-law, so desperate to show off to all her pathetic church friends, that she practically threw her own daughters at me. I did not steal Morgan's identity. Beatrice stole it and handed me the cash on a silver platter just to buy my approval. The entire congregation let out a collective gasp of pure revulsion. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the sound of ice melting in abandoned cocktail glasses. Desmond, the senior deacon, took a slow, deliberate step away from Beatrice, as if her very presence was suddenly toxic, carrying the stench of deep moral rot. My mother stood perfectly still for a fraction of a second, the sheer brutality of Connor's betrayal completely short-circuiting her brain. The man she had worshipped, the man she had sacrificed my financial future and my place in the family to protect, had just publicly discarded her like a piece of worthless trash. He did not just throw her under the bus, he backed over her repeatedly to save his own miserable life. He stood in front of her entire community and called her a desperate, pathetic old fool. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded animal caught in a snare. Her knees simply gave out beneath her, unable to support the crushing weight of her public humiliation. She collapsed heavily onto the perfectly manicured grass, the vibrant peach silk suit crumpling around her defeated frame. Her hands flew to her face, pulling frantically at the heavy string of pearls around her neck until the silk cord snapped, sending dozens of expensive white beads bouncing and scattering across the green lawn like tiny hailstones. She reached a shaking hand toward Connor, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, begging for the illusion to return, begging him to take the cruel words back, but Connor just looked down at her with unvarnished, absolute disgust. "I never even wanted this family." He spat the vitriol in his voice, echoing sharply across the quiet water of the lake behind him. "You are all just a bunch of loud, desperate social climbers, pretending to be something you are not. I used you because you were easy marks, because you were so desperate to feel superior to your own daughter that you ignored every single warning sign. You were too blinded by your own greed and your pathetic need for status to see that I was just using your house to hide from the people I owe money to." Sierra let out a piercing, shattering scream. The delusion that had sustained her entire marriage, the fantasy of her wealthy aristocratic husband, was violently stripped away in front of her friends and church members, leaving her completely exposed. She ran across the patio, her designer heels clicking frantically against the stone, oblivious to the shattered glass from the champagne flutes. She grabbed Connor's arm, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric of his ruined, sweat-soaked suit. "Connor, please stop it," she begged, her face streaked with dark makeup, her voice cracking with absolute denial and desperation. "Please, you are scaring everyone. Just tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you love me. Tell them we are going to our new house today." Connor looked at the woman he had sworn to cherish and protect, the woman carrying his name, his eyes completely devoid of anything resembling human empathy or affection. She was no longer a useful shield, she was just another anchor holding him down as the trap finally closed around his neck. He ripped his arm away from her grasping fingers and shoved her hard, squarely in the center of her chest. Sierra flew backward, her arms flailing wildly as she crashed onto the hard stone patio, twisting her ankle and scraping her manicured hands against the rough concrete. The crowd erupted into chaotic shouts of panic and outrage, church elders moving forward to intervene, while the shadowlenders reached into their jackets preparing to collect their debt by any means necessary. But the sound of the screaming crowd was instantly drowned out by a noise that cut through the warm afternoon air with absolute terrifying authority. From the long paved driveway behind the house came the sudden deafening wail of federal sirens. The heavy crunch of tactical boots hit the gravel in perfect unison as dark armored vehicles swarmed the property line, sealing the wrought iron gates permanently and trapping every single person inside the estate. The deafening wail of federal sirens shattered the warm afternoon air, and suddenly the entire estate was swarming with dark tactical uniforms. Heavy black boots trampled over the pristine flower beds and crushed the fallen white pearls my mother had scattered across the grass just moments before. Federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests emblazoned with FBI across the back flooded onto the stone patio from both the main driveway and the side yards. Local police officers moved in perfect synchronization, securing the private dock and blocking every single exit route along the lakefront. The lavish housewarming party instantly devolved into absolute blind panic. The hired jazz abandoned their instruments, knocking over music stands and expensive speakers in their haste to get out of the way. Wealthy church elders scrambled backward, pushing each other aside and dropping plates of expensive catered food directly onto the concrete. The sharp crash of breaking china added to the chaotic symphony of shouting voices and running footsteps. The group of shadowlenders realized immediately what was happening. The dangerous men in the ill-fitting dark suits tried to melt into the panicked crowd, hoping to slip out through the chaos and escape the federal net. But the agents were fully prepared for them. Two massive tactical officers intercepted the primary lenders near the carving station, shoving them firmly against the white canvas of the catering tent with absolute authority. Desmond, the senior deacon, was practically crawling over the rented patio chairs to get away from the advancing raid. The illusion of high society elegance was violently ripped away, leaving only the raw, terrifying reality of a federal takedown. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the stone patio, watching the complete destruction unfold around me. A team of 4 heavily armed federal agents rushed directly past me, completely ignoring my presence. They did not even look at the manila envelope still scattered across the ground. They had a single specific target, and they locked onto him with terrifying precision. Connor realized his shadowlenders were neutralized, and his exit gates were permanently sealed. The arrogant aristocratic facade was entirely gone, replaced by the blind instinct of a trapped animal. He scrambled to his feet, slipping awkwardly on the spilled champagne and shattered crystal. He made a desperate, pathetic dash toward the tall, wrought-iron fence separating the property from the neighbor estate. His expensive Italian leather shoes tore up thick chunks of the manicured lawn as he ran blindly away from the sirens. He threw his entire body weight at the heavy metal fence, his fingers grasping wildly at the iron bars, trying to pull himself over the top. He was breathing in ragged, desperate gasps, his perfect hair now plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat. It was a useless, humiliating attempt at escape for a man who had spent the last year pretending to be invincible. The lead FBI agent closed the distance in seconds, his tactical boots tearing across the grass. He grabbed Connor by the back of his ruined, sweat-soaked suit jacket and yanked him backward with absolute brutal force. Connor flew backward off the iron fence and slammed hard onto the muddy grass. The breath knocked completely out of his lungs. 3 more agents descended on him instantly, driving their knees into his lower back and pinning his arms forcefully behind him. Connor thrashed wildly, screaming incoherent pleas and kicking his legs, but the tactical team easily overpowered his weak struggles. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed clearly over the panicked cries of the gathered wedding guests. The lead agent grabbed Connor by the shoulders and hauled him roughly to his knees, forcing him to face the destroyed party and the terrified faces of the people he had scammed. The agent leaned in close, his voice booming with unshakable authority over the quiet yard, ensuring every single person heard the charges. Connor, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. The formal legal words fell like heavy stones over the pristine lakefront estate, sealing his absolute permanent destruction. My mother was still crumpled on the grass a few yards away, watching the federal agents drag her golden son-in-law to his feet. She was hyperventilating, her hands covering her face, unable to process the total collapse of her carefully constructed world. But Sierra was the one who truly broke. She had watched the man she built her entire identity around violently shove her to the ground and then try to run away like a coward, leaving her to face the angry shadowlenders alone. Her designer dress was stained with dirt and spilled drinks, and her expensive makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, completely ignoring the sharp pieces of broken glass digging into her skin. She did not try to run toward Connor or comfort our mother. Instead, she crawled frantically across the rough concrete directly toward me. She dragged herself to my feet, grasping at the hem of my pants with shaking, desperate hands. Her fingernails dug into the fabric as if I were the only solid object left in her crumbling universe. "Morgan, please!" she sobbed hysterically, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail of pure, unfiltered desperation. "You have to stop them, Morgan, please. You know the police chief. You know all the local authorities from your old job. Tell them it is a massive mistake. Tell them he is innocent." She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, pleading for the exact same sibling loyalty she had spent her entire life stepping on to elevate herself. Her whole body was trembling violently as she begged me to use my connections to save the criminal who had just publicly humiliated our mother and shoved her to the ground. "They cannot take him away. Morgan, please do something. Please, you have to fix this. Lily needs her dad." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic broken woman clinging to my legs. I did not reach down to help her up from the wet concrete. I did not offer a single word of comfort or reassurance to ease her panic. I let the heavy silence stretch between us, watching the harsh reality of her situation finally register in her tear-filled eyes. The sirens continued to wail in the background, casting flashing red and blue lights across the faces of the stunned congregation. I slowly stepped back, forcing her trembling hands to drop away from my clothes, leaving her kneeling alone on the patio. "You laughed when Mom told me I was not her daughter anymore," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any human warmth. "Your husband's felonies are not my problem." Sierra stared up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure disbelief. She opened her mouth to scream or beg again, but the sound died in her throat as two federal agents dragged her thrashing husband past us toward the driveway. I stepped around her crumpled form on the patio, completely unfazed by her despair. The federal raid was a highly coordinated machine, but the local police department had their own specific assignment today. I watched as two uniformed local officers detached themselves from the perimeter barricade and began walking purposefully across the ruined grass. Their target was not the fleeing Shadowlenders or the disgraced groom. They were heading straight for the woman still sitting in the mud, clutching a broken string of pearls. Beatrice saw them coming. The terrified fog that had clouded her eyes suddenly lifted, replaced by the arrogant indignation she had relied on for 6 decades. She scrambled to her feet, her peach silk suit stained with damp earth and spilled champagne. She raised her chin, attempting to summon the formidable authority of a senior church matriarch. "Officers, you need to clear this property immediately," she commanded, her voice trembling, but loud enough to carry over the chaotic murmurs of the remaining wedding guests. "My son-in-law is the victim of a terrible misunderstanding, and you are trespassing on a private family celebration." She actually tried to shoo them away with a flick of her manicured hand, as if they were unruly children running through her garden. The lead officer, a tall woman with a severe expression, did not even break her stride. "Beatrice Wilson," she said, projecting her voice with absolute clinical authority, "I have a warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." The words hung in the heavy afternoon air, silencing the entire yard. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless laugh, looking wildly toward the crowd of church elders for support. "This is ridiculous," she stammered, taking a step backward. "I am a pillar of this community. I am the head of the Ladies' Auxiliary. You cannot speak to me this way." The officer reached to her utility belt and pulled out a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Mrs. Wilson," the officer instructed, entirely unmoved by my mother's social credentials. Beatrice physically recoiled, her eyes darting toward me with a look of absolute venomous realization. "You did this!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You set up your own mother, you ungrateful, vindictive little girl." The officers did not give her time to finish her tirade. They moved in swiftly, grabbing her arms and forcing them behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut sounded like a final heavy gavel coming down on her reign of terror. I watched the entire sequence with cold, absolute detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. The woman who had stolen my financial future and actively tried to ruin my life was finally experiencing the brutal reality of accountability. "Morgan, please, you have to stop this." The desperate voice came from my right. I turned to see my father, Desmond, pushing his way through a cluster of horrified choir members. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned, and he was sweating profusely, his chest heaving with panic. He stumbled onto the stone patio, looking like a man watching his house burn to the ground. "Morgan, tell them it is a mistake," he pleaded, his hands shaking as he reached out toward me, but stopped short of touching my arm. "She is your mother, Morgan. She is my wife. You cannot let them put her in the back of a police car like a common criminal. Think of the humiliation. Think of our family name." I stared at the man who had supposedly been my father, my protector for 3 decades. He had always preferred to hide behind his Bible verses and his senior deacon title, while Beatrice actively dismantled my self-esteem. "You want to talk about family name?" Desmond, I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and perfectly steady. Where was your concern for our family name when she was forging my signature on federal loan documents? Where was your fatherly protection when she was telling the entire congregation I was a bitter, jealous failure just to make Sierra look better? You knew exactly how she treated me. You knew she was draining my accounts to fund Connor's fake empire, and you just sat in your leather armchair and let it happen because it was easier than standing up to her. Desmond physically shrank away from me, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked around at the church members who were now staring at him with undisguised disgust. But she is your blood, he stammered, a pathetic final attempt to use guilt as a weapon. The Bible says we must honor our parents. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. You watched her destroy me my whole life, I said, letting every syllable hit him like a physical strike. Now watch her face the consequences. Desmond crumbled completely. He lowered his head and backed away, retreating into the crowd, a broken, cowardly man who had traded his daughter's well-being for a comfortable, quiet life. The final confrontation seemed to break the last remaining spell over the yard. The church elders and the wealthy gossips suddenly realized the toxic fallout of this scandal was going to ruin anyone standing too close to the blast zone. The mass exodus began. It was not a polite departure, it was a desperate, panicked stampede. The catering staff had already vanished, leaving behind overturned silver chafing dishes and massive towers of melting ice sculptures. The rich mahogany tables my mother had rented to showcase her wealth were now covered in spilled caviar and abandoned plates of expensive appetizers. The elderly church women who had spent the entire afternoon whispering malicious rumors about my supposed failure were now pushing each other out of the way to reach the wrought iron exit gates faster. They practically trampled the expensive floral arrangements that had been knocked onto the pathway, their luxury high heels slipping in the mud and spilled wine. The absolute panic in their eyes was the final validation of my victory. They had come to witness my surrender, and instead they had become collateral damage in my retaliation. The perfect, flawless image of the aristocratic Wilson family was completely, permanently shattered. It was not just a private embarrassment, it was a public execution broadcast to the exact people my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress. They were fleeing the property as if the soil itself was contaminated. I watched the crowd dissolve into the driveway, leaving behind a battlefield of destroyed catering displays, crushed champagne glasses, and trampled floral arrangements. Down the long paved driveway, the local police officers marched Beatrice past the catering tents toward their parked cruisers. She stumbled once, her ruined peach suit dragging against the pavement, but the officers simply hauled her back upright without a single word of comfort. She looked back toward the patio one last time, her eyes searching for anyone who might save her. She looked at Desmond, who refused to meet her gaze. She looked at Sierra, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the ground. And finally she looked at me. I did not blink. I did not turn away. I stood tall and watched the exact moment her spirit finally broke. She lowered her head completely, surrendering to the reality of her own destruction. The officers pressed her down into the back seat of the cruiser, her head ducking under the doorframe before they slammed the heavy metal shut, locking her in the dark interior. A few yards away, federal agents were finishing loading Connor into a dark, armored transport vehicle. The synchronized wail of multiple sirens roared to life, cutting through the evening air. The convoy of flashing red and blue lights began rolling down the driveway, carrying the toxic remnants of my family away to their respective prison cells. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the stone patio. The deafening sound of the sirens slowly faded into the distance, until it was replaced by the gentle lapping of the lake water against my private dock. The manicured lawn was a destroyed, muddy wasteland. Abandoned crystal glasses caught the fading sunlight, reflecting shattered rainbows across the wet concrete. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs completely. The yard was a chaotic mess of party debris and broken illusions, but the silence was beautiful. I was completely alone on my pristine estate, and for the first time in my life, I was entirely free. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut, echoing loudly through the cold marble hallway. Exactly 7 days had passed since the tactical raid on my pristine lakefront estate, and the wheels of justice were moving with absolute brutal efficiency. I sat in the back row of the gallery, watching the complete dismantling of the man who had tried to destroy me. Connor stood before the federal magistrate, wearing a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit that completely erased his carefully crafted aristocratic persona. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains that rattled loudly every time he shifted his weight. The arrogant smirk he always wore like a crown was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, sunken look of a trapped, desperate animal. The federal prosecutor presented a massive mountain of undeniable evidence detailing his international wire fraud, his extensive money laundering, and the elaborate network of offshore shell companies he used to drain corporate pension funds. The courtroom gallery was packed with furious, defrauded investors and aggressive financial journalists documenting his ruin. When his assigned public defender weakly requested bail, the judge did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. Considering the defendant was actively attempting to acquire fraudulent property deeds to finance his escape out of the country, the judge declared him an extreme flight risk. The loud, sharp crack of the wooden gavel sealed his fate permanently, denying bail and locking him in a maximum security federal holding facility until his trial. Without the forged deed to my lake house to use as guaranteed collateral, the fragile house of cards my family had built instantly collapsed into dust. The financial slaughter was swift and absolutely merciless. Federal agents had immediately frozen every single bank account and asset tied to Connor leaving Sierra, with absolutely zero access to his stolen wealth. My mother was currently sitting in a cramped county jail cell, awaiting her own arraignment for aggravated identity theft and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. She was entirely unable to post her massive bail because all of her personal accounts were under strict federal investigation for suspicious transfers. The glorious high society matriarch who cared only about her pristine reputation was now wearing a scratchy uniform and eating gray cafeteria food, surrounded by the exact type of people she had spent her entire life looking down upon. Desmond, my cowardly father, had completely vanished, hiding in a cheap motel across the state line, terrified that the federal agents would arrest him next, simply by association. He abandoned his wife to face the legal consequences alone, perfectly demonstrating the absolute lack of loyalty in their marriage. But the most brutal reality check fell squarely on Sierra's shoulders. Her glamorous downtown penthouse apartment, the one she constantly flaunted on her social media feeds to prove her absolute superiority over me, was not actually owned by her wealthy husband. The federal audit revealed it was heavily mortgaged and dangerously over-leveraged. Connor had been 3 months behind on the massive payments, desperately hoping to use my property to pay off the massive arrears. The bank acted with lightning speed, serving official foreclosure notices and giving my sister less than 48 hours to completely vacate the premises. The expensive designer clothes, the imported Italian furniture, and the glittering jewelry she prized so deeply were currently being boxed up by relentless repossession agents to cover her outstanding debts. Her carefully curated online presence was destroyed overnight as her followers watched her luxurious life disintegrate. The illusion of her perfect wealthy lifestyle was completely shattered, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and the toxic reputation of being married to a federal fugitive. I was standing in my newly restored kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, when my phone buzzed violently against the cool granite countertop. The screen displayed an unknown local number. My primary phone number had been permanently changed immediately after the raid, but a few local utility contacts still had my emergency line. I answered the call, expecting a routine update from my landscaping company regarding the repair of the trampled lawn. Instead, the frantic, breathless, and unmistakable voice of my sister filled the quiet room. The connection was highly staticky and hollow, indicating she was using a cheap prepaid burner phone purchased from a gas station. "Morgan, you have to let me in right now," she demanded, the familiar tone of entitled audacity slipping right back into her voice, despite her entire fake life burning to the ground. Federal agents completely confiscated my cell phone and my laptop, and the bank just locked the heavy glass doors to my apartment building. They literally changed the security codes while I was standing in the lobby. I am sitting in my car with Lily, and we have absolutely nowhere to go. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, looking out the large bay window at the peaceful, undisturbed water of my private lake. The sheer nerve she possessed was genuinely astounding. After spending her entire existence actively participating in my emotional destruction and eagerly plotting to steal my only major financial asset, she still believed she had full unrestricted access to my resources. "You are going to send the security gate code to this number right now, Morgan?" She continued, her voice rising in pitch as her blind panic mounted. "Lily is crying in the back seat, and we are literally homeless on the street. Mom is locked up in a concrete cell, and Dad refuses to answer any of my calls because he is terrified the feds are tapping his phone lines. None of my country club friends will even look at me. They act like I have a contagious disease. You are my sister, and you have a massive luxury house with 5 empty bedrooms just sitting there. I am moving in with the baby until Connor gets this ridiculous legal misunderstanding sorted out, and you are going to help me because family sticks together." I listened to her heavy, desperate breathing through the cheap phone receiver, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. The exact same sister who had laughed directly in my face when our mother publicly disowned me just a week ago was now aggressively demanding the very shelter she had tried to fraudulently steal from my hands. The delusion that she could simply ignore her malicious betrayal and invoke family loyalty was staggering. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of lingering anger. My tone was perfectly smooth, flat, and absolutely lethal. "I suggest you call the local homeless shelters," I said, letting the absolute brutal finality of my words sink deep into her panicked brain. "My house is not a charity organization for people who actively plotted to steal from me." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, permanently severing the connection and cutting her out of my life forever. The Sunday morning service at Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church was usually a vibrant display of high fashion and loud praise, but this weekend, the atmosphere was thick with suffocating tension. My mother had spent decades building her toxic kingdom within those stained glass walls, ruling over the congregation from her designated pew in the third row. She had wielded her position as the head of the ladies' auxiliary like a heavy weapon, using her social influence to dictate local standings and destroy the reputations of anyone who dared to question her absolute authority. But the federal raid on my estate had completely shattered the illusion of her divine superiority. The local evening news had broadcasted the unedited footage of her being forcefully shoved into the back of a police cruiser in her mud-stained peach silk suit. The church gossip network had absolutely feasted on the carcass of her ruined reputation. The senior pastor stood at the heavy wooden pulpit, his expression grave and unyielding as he addressed the packed, silent sanctuary. He did not shout or preach a sermon of forgiveness. He simply read a formal, prepared statement, officially stripping Beatrice of all her leadership titles, removing her name from the church registry, and severing her ties with the administration forever. The wealthy women who used to fetch my mother's sweet tea and hang on her every malicious word sat perfectly rigid in their expensive hats, collectively deciding to erase her from their reality. They whispered behind their silk fans, calling her a pathetic fraud and a desperate thief, treating the Wilson family name like a highly contagious disease that could infect their own carefully curated lives. Desmond was not there to defend his wife. He had completely abandoned his deacon duties, remaining hidden in his cheap off-highway motel room, too cowardly to face the righteous judgment of his peers. The community that had once praised them and elevated them to the highest tier of local Black society now treated them as absolute pariahs, casting them out into the cold with permanent, unforgiving finality. The brutal reality of the criminal justice system moved with terrifying speed, completely ignoring my mother's previous social status and her demands for special treatment. She had spent 3 agonizing days in a damp concrete holding cell before a skeptical bail bondsman finally accepted the collateral from her few remaining unseized assets. The brief taste of incarceration had broken her spirit completely. The federal prosecutor was entirely unbothered by her frantic claims of ignorance. The long paper trail of forged signatures, fake notary stamps, and fraudulent bank transfers was absolute and undeniable. Her exhausted, overworked public defender had laid out the grim mathematics of her bleak situation. The aggravated identity theft charges carried strict mandatory federal minimums. She was looking at a minimum of 10 years behind high concrete walls, wearing a scratchy, oversized prison uniform, unless the primary victim agreed to a massive downward departure and formal leniency. The sheer terror of spending her remaining golden years dying in a federal penitentiary finally broke through her impenetrable wall of arrogance. The woman who had publicly disowned me, the woman who had orchestrated my financial ruin to impress a white con artist, was now entirely dependent on my mercy to survive her own catastrophic mistakes. She reached out through her legal counsel begging for a face-to-face meeting, pleading for any possible arrangement that would keep her out of a concrete cage. I did not ignore the pathetic request. I agreed to a single negotiation, but I dictated the exact terms of her surrender. I would formally request the district attorney to drop the hardest felony identity theft charges, the ones carrying the mandatory minimums, saving her from federal prison. But my mercy had a massive non-negotiable price. She had to sign a comprehensive legally binding confession detailing every single fraudulent act she committed against me. And she had to sign a permanent ironclad restraining order, barring her from ever contacting me, approaching my property, or invoking my name again for the rest of her natural life. The final meeting took place in the sterile, freezing conference room of my corporate attorney's office high above the sprawling downtown skyline. The massive room was all sharp angles, heavy glass, and cold gray steel, completely devoid of any human warmth or emotional comfort. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table, flanked by two ruthless corporate litigators, perfectly still and completely detached from the situation. The heavy, solid oak door slowly opened, and Beatrice walked in. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering and deeply pathetic. The formidable aristocratic matriarch was entirely gone erased by the consequences of her own actions. Her normally perfect hair was unstyled and flat, showing wide track marks of stark gray at the roots. She was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray pantsuit that hung loosely on her rapidly shrinking frame. Her skin looked sallow and deeply lined, the crushing weight of her imminent financial and social ruin etching deep dark grooves around her trembling mouth and exhausted eyes. She did not look out at the panoramic view of the bustling city. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the polished, reflective surface of the table, taking a seat opposite me with slow, shaking movements. Her public defender sat beside her, looking completely drained and eager to end the nightmare. The heavy silence in the room stretched out, creating a suffocating pressure vacuum that highlighted the absolute irreversible shift in our power dynamic. My lead attorney wordlessly slid a thick stack of pristine, heavy legal documents across the black glass table, stopping them exactly in front of my mother's trembling hands. The paperwork was ruthless, exact, and exhaustive. It detailed every single forgery, every stolen dollar, every malicious lie she had constructed to drain my personal accounts and illegally fund Connor's fake real estate empire. It stripped away all her maternal excuses and forced her to legally accept the absolute ugly truth of her own toxic greed in writing. The restraining order attached at the back was equally brutal, permanently severing her legal and physical access to my existence with zero loopholes. If she signed, she would successfully avoid the mandatory federal prison sentence, but she would permanently cement her own guilt and officially agree to her own permanent exile from my world. She stared down at the stark black ink, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow gasps as she struggled to breathe in the cold, air-conditioned room. She reached out with a shaking, unsteady hand, picking up the heavy metal pen my lawyer had provided. She paused, the sharp tip of the pen hovering just a millimeter above the signature line. She slowly looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot red and swimming with desperate, unshed tears, attempting to summon the ghost of her maternal authority one last pathetic time. "Morgan, please," she whispered, her voice cracking into a weak, broken rasp that barely carried across the table. "I am your mother. You came from me. You cannot just erase me like this. I was only trying to help your sister. I was only doing what I thought was best for the family. I did not blink. I did not lean forward to comfort her. I sat perfectly upright, completely immune to her desperate emotional manipulation. My face was a blank, unreadable mask of cold, clinical detachment. I felt absolutely no pity, no sadness, no lingering childlike desire for her affection or approval. The broken woman sitting across from me was not a mother. She was just a failed parasite realizing the host had permanently and violently cut her off. The time for family loyalty expired the exact moment you handed my identity to a thief. I said, my voice perfectly flat and echoing harshly off the thick glass walls. Sign the paper, Beatrice, or we walk out of this room right now and you can explain your creative parenting choices to a federal judge at your sentencing hearing. The brutal, unyielding finality of my words completely extinguished the last tiny flicker of hope hiding in her bloodshot eyes. Her shoulders collapsed entirely, surrendering to the crushing, heavy reality of her complete defeat. She lowered her head, pressing the metal pen to the heavy white paper. The sharp scratching sound of the tip against the page was the only noise in the dead quiet room as she signed away her pride, her lies, and her access to my life forever. She pushed the signed documents back across the glass table, her hands dropping limply to her lap like dead weights. She looked up at me one final time, her face twisting with bitter, resentful, absolute defeat. "You destroyed this family," she whispered, the venom in her voice completely hollow and powerless. I just turned on the lights. The heavy glass doors of the downtown executive boardroom slid shut, sealing the room in absolute quiet. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, looking across at the executives from the city's largest development firm. The air was thick with the kind of high-stakes tension that used to make my heart race, but today my pulse was perfectly steady. My lead counsel slid the final contract across the polished wood. It was a $68 million commercial acquisition, the absolute largest real estate deal of my entire career. I picked up my heavy fountain pen and signed my name on the final line, securing my firm as the primary broker for the new downtown skyline project. The development executive stood up, reaching across the table to shake my hand with genuine professional respect. There was no underlying condescension, no toxic whispers, and no familial sabotage, waiting to drain the commission from my accounts. The oppressive static noise that my mother and sister had pumped into my brain for 3 decades was completely gone, without their constant emotional manipulation and financial parasitism. My career had not just recovered, it had absolutely skyrocketed into a stratosphere they could never even comprehend. I walked out of the corporate high-rise and stepped into the warm city sun, feeling an unparalleled sense of total absolute clarity. The physical healing of my environment happened with the exact same ruthless efficiency. I hired a premium landscape architecture firm to completely excavate the ruined backyard of my lake house. They tore up every single inch of the mud-stained grass where my mother's fake high society party had violently collapsed. They planted mature weeping willows and installed imported stone pathways, erasing any lingering ghost of the chaos. Inside the house, I purged everything that held even a microscopic connection to my blood relatives. The guest room Sierra had prematurely tried to claim for her daughter was stripped bare and transformed into a sprawling home library with floor-to-ceiling cherry wood shelves. The space was now filled with the rich smell of old paper and leather, completely sanitized of her entitled energy. To fill the newly purified space, I leaned heavily into the only people who had ever genuinely wanted to see me win. I hosted a private, intimate dinner on my newly constructed cedar deck overlooking the calm evening water. There were no gossiping church elders or fake shadow lenders trying to project false wealth. Instead, the table was surrounded by my chosen family. My closest friends from Howard University sat to my left, laughing loudly and sharing genuine stories of our early struggles. My professional mentors, women who had actually guided my career instead of attempting to steal from it, raised their glasses in a heartfelt toast to my recent corporate victory. We drank expensive wine and ate food prepared by a private chef, while the sun dipped slowly below the tree line. The laughter was authentic, and the love was entirely unconditional. I looked around the table at the faces of people who respected my boundaries and celebrated my intelligence. This was what an actual family looked like. Miles away across the city, the brutal reality of consequence was settling heavily over the people who shared my last name. I did not have to seek out the information because the local financial news happily broadcasted the final chapter of Connor's pathetic downfall. He stood in front of a federal judge earlier that week, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence regarding his wire fraud and stolen pension funds. His expensive defense attorney had advised him to completely surrender. He took a binding plea deal, avoiding the maximum sentence, but guaranteeing he would spend the next 5 straight years inside a medium-security federal penitentiary. There would be no luxury golf trips or fake real estate pitches behind those reinforced concrete walls. The financial blast radius of his conviction completely incinerated whatever was left of my family. With all of Connor's stolen assets permanently seized by the government, and my mother's bank accounts drained by legal fees, their living situation had deteriorated into absolute misery. My corporate attorney sent me a final background update confirming their new address. Sierra, the woman who used to mock my perfectly tailored business suits and demand access to my luxury estate, was now working a grueling minimum wage shift at a local discount retail store. She spent her days folding cheap clothes for angry customers just to afford basic groceries. At night, she returned to a cramped, dark studio apartment located in a highly undesirable neighborhood near the industrial district. She was sharing that single, tiny, suffocating room with Beatrice and Desmond. The three of them were trapped together in less than 600 square feet of cheap linoleum and peeling paint, forced to look at each other every single day and remember exactly how they had lost everything. The matriarch, who once cared only about maintaining a flawless public image, was now sleeping on a cheap pull-out sofa in a studio apartment, listening to her golden child complain about her aching feet from standing behind a cash register. I stood in the quiet calm of my home office, listening to the gentle hum of the central air conditioning. The morning sunlight poured through the large bay windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I picked up the small stack of morning mail my assistant had left on the pristine marble desk. There were a few corporate invitations, a quarterly financial statement, and one plain white envelope. The return address was written in cramped, familiar handwriting. It was from Sierra. It was likely a desperate, sprawling letter begging for financial forgiveness, or attempting to use her daughter to manipulate my emotions one final time. I held the cheap paper in my hand, feeling the slight weight of whatever pathetic apologies or toxic demands she had stuffed inside. I did not feel a single flicker of anger or sadness or curiosity. The emotional cord was completely permanently severed, leaving nothing but absolute indifference. I did not open the envelope. I did not even pause to wonder what she had written. I walked smoothly across the hardwood floor to the heavy-duty industrial shredder sitting in the corner of the room. I pressed the power button, listening to the sharp mechanical whir of the steel blades spinning to life. I dropped the unopened letter directly into the feed slot and watched without blinking as it was instantly violently pulled apart into 1,000 meaningless shreds of paper. The cool ocean breeze brushed against my face as I stood on the edge of the private dock watching the sun dip below the horizon of the lake. The deep orange and purple hues reflected off the water, creating a breathtaking canvas of absolute peace. A few minutes later, a warm hand gently wrapped around mine. I turned to see Aaron standing beside me, smiling softly in the fading twilight. He was a successful software engineer and a deeply compassionate man whom I had met during my corporate restructuring project 2 years ago. Unlike the toxic figures of my past, Aaron valued my intelligence, respected my boundaries, and loved me for exactly who I was. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" he asked, gently squeezing my hand. I smiled, looking back toward the brightly lit lake house behind us. "Completely ready," I replied. Tomorrow morning we were hosting a private, intimate celebration on the lawn. My firm had officially reached a milestone of funding over 50 young women in business, providing them with the resources and mentorship they needed to achieve true financial independence. My chosen family, My closest friends, mentors, and true allies were all staying at the estate to celebrate with us. As we walked back toward the house, my phone chimed in my pocket with a silent notification. Out of habit. I glanced at the screen. It was an automated update from the legal registry regarding the ongoing bankruptcy proceedings of my former family. Without the lake house to use as leverage, and with Connor's assets permanently seized by the federal government, my family had completely collapsed under the weight of their own greed. Sierra was still working long, exhausting shifts at a discount retail store trying to support herself. Beatrice and Desmond in their tiny, cramped studio apartment. My mother, who had spent her entire life obsessing over her public image and social standing, was now completely erased from high society, reduced to living on basic government assistance and the meager charity of the few people who still felt pity for her. I closed the notification and slid the phone back into my pocket, without feeling a single ripple of anger, sadness, or regret. There was no desire for further revenge, and no lingering pain from their betrayal. The darkness of their toxicity had been entirely replaced by the light of my own life. I stepped onto the brightly lit cedar deck, where the warm sound of genuine laughter and clinking wine glasses filled the evening air. My friends raised their glasses as Aaron and I joined them at the table, welcoming us into the warmth of authentic love and mutual respect. I took a deep breath of the fresh, cool air, looking out at the pristine, quiet lake one last time. I had survived their betrayal, broken the toxic cycle, and built an empire on my own terms. My past was permanently behind me, and my future was entirely my own. True independence is the ultimate protection against manipulation. Morgan's journey highlights that when you build your life on self-reliance, rather than seeking external validation, you become untouchable. Toxic dynamics often thrive on your desperate need for approval. Once you let go of that need, their power over you dissolves. Setting firm boundaries is crucial not just for protecting assets, but for safeguarding your own peace and integrity. Ultimately, your worth is defined by your actions, not by the roles others try to force upon you. Stay grounded, value your autonomy, and never trade your success for someone else's comfort. 1. Take control of your narrative today. Stop seeking approval and start building the life you deserve.